We've been hearing a lot about trade this week.
Historic new global tariffs.
Higher tariffs on about 60 countries.
The ripple effect of the tariffs.
He is committed to these tariffs.
But are we even sure what a tariff is? What is a trade deficit anyway? And why is the US going after countries that it has a trade surplus with? Like Australia? We thought we'd find out. It's what we do on Reuters Econ World. Every week, we pick a phrase or buzzword and go deep on the economic principles and ideas driving the biggest news around the world. So this week, Australia and the global trade war. I'm your host, Carmel Crimmins in Dublin. Okay, so we all know that US President Donald Trump has picked a trade fight with dozens of countries.
This is one of the most important days, in my opinion, in American history. It's our declaration of economic independence.
Trump and his officials have given a variety of reasons why the US is imposing tariffs. One of those reasons is to cut America's trade deficit with other countries and to retaliate against countries that have their own tariffs on US goods. Let's take each of those concepts in turn. First, what is a tariff? Well, it's a tax on goods imported into a country, and it's paid by the people who import that good, not by the people who are selling it. That's why Trump's tariffs are expected to raise prices in the United States, as well as tax revenues for the US government. Now, if the US has a trade deficit with another country, that means the US imports more goods from that country than it exports to them. Trump says the tariffs he's imposing are reciprocal, aiming to match the tariffs other countries charge the United States.
They do it to us and we do it to them.
But the formula he's using to calculate those tariffs has nothing to do with the tariff rates that other countries charge. In fact, he's even imposing tariffs on countries that the US has a trade surplus with, like Australia. To try and understand what this all means for Australia and its Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, as he seeks re-election, let's hear from two correspondents in Sydney. Kirsty Needham, who covers politics, and Wayne Cole, who covers financial markets. I caught up with them on a really volatile day for world markets. Kirsty, Wayne, hi.
Hi there.
Hi.
So, not much going on, right? You know,
It's a quiet old day in Sydney.
it's not a busy week for journalists.
Wild day in markets. Oh,
Wild day.
yeah.
So, we're looking at trade from all different angles. We want to look at it from Australia. Fascinating, right?
Yeah.
Like the trade balance between the US and Australia has run in America's favor kind of like since the Truman era, and Australia doesn't have any tariffs on US goods, and yet you've got a 10% tariff just been slapped on you.
Yeah.
How are Australians taking all of this, Wayne?
Badly. It's mind-bogglingly strange. Nobody kind of expected it to happen this way. So everybody's thinking, well, how do we get around this? You know?
And it puts Australia in a really tight spot, right?
So Australia is like at the mercy of global trade winds, right? And its biggest customer is China.
Yeah.
China has had the biggest tariffs on it. So anything that hurts China hurts Australia. And markets, particularly the big hedge funds and the big investors, they sell and buy the Aussie dollar as a proxy for the Chinese yuan because it's very hard to trade the yuan. It has capital controls on it. So instead of trading Chinese assets, they trade the Aussie dollar. So if you want to sell a yuan, you sell the Aussie.
Yeah.
The poor thing. You know?
So that's what's so interesting, that in a way, you could argue Australia got away lightly. It got the minimum tariff 10%. So it's kind of comparatively versus others not doing too bad. But China is its number one export market, right? It relies on China for its economic wealth.
Yeah.
So what's worse for Australia, 10% tariff on its exports to the US or the tariffs that have been slapped on China?
Tariffs on China.
Right.
Only about 4% of Australian exports go to America.
Yeah.
But 34% of our exports go to China, right? And China is the marginal buyer of commodities in the world, so it tends to set the price of major commodities like iron ore.
Yeah.
So if its economy runs into trouble, Australia's economy will surely run into trouble.
Right.
And that's the linkage that's really got people worried.
And of course, there is as well the whole security relationship. Like, Australia has a very close security relationship with the US. I mean, Kirsty, was the Australian government expecting this, or did this actually come as a shock?
I think both. And it's a really tricky situation for Australia, especially in the middle of an election campaign. So because of that, US security alliance is so important to Australia down here in the Indo-Pacific. It doesn't talk about the defence threat that it perceives from China, but if you look at their defence shake-up in recent years, it is all geared towards if there was a conflict involving China, the small size of Australia's population, the vastness of its geography, it really needs the US alliance. It has a multi-billion-dollar nuclear submarine deal with the United States, AUKUS. And for all those reasons, they were really not wanting to say too much that could catch Donald Trump's attention or anger him.
Right.
However, in the middle of an election campaign, with tariffs being slapped on all Australian goods, it's playing really badly with the Australian public. So you have two political leaders, the Prime Minister running for re-election and an opposition leader that need to be shown to be standing up for Australia and standing up for Australia's national interests. So you are seeing some quite strong rhetoric now from the opposition leader that, he would have a fight with Donald Trump if he needed to.
Right.
Albanese saying this was not an act of a friend. Several times, Peter Navarro, who strongly supports and is driving the tariffs, several comments that he's made on American media seems to link Australia's economy as so inextricably linked to China's economy, but it's his way of hitting China. That's really problematic if that view has become entrenched.
So we haven't heard back from the White House on whether that is the official view of the administration. So how is Albanese playing it?
So Albanese is playing it that, on our free trade agreement, all US goods come into Australia tariff-free. We should not have any reciprocal tariff from the US. But he's also saying, if you look around the world, Australia only got 10%.
Right.
So comparatively, the competitive position in the US market against other foreign countries is maintained. But it's in an election campaign, it's a really tricky diplomacy act.
Yeah, and Albanese said he wouldn't retaliate, right? But I suppose, both he and Peter Dutton, the Liberal Party leader, said they'd stand up for the country's national interests. Like, do we know what the game plan is here post the election? I mean, we don't know who's going to win, but do we think that sense of we won't retaliate, we'll negotiate, is that how they plan to navigate through, regardless of who wins?
That's what both sides are saying. So Dutton is saying he would be better at dealing with Trump, that he could have negotiated no tariff even now, and that Australia should really leverage its defence relationship and its huge stores of critical minerals. This is one thing that we know from Trump's negotiations over Ukraine, that the US really wants to build up its critical mineral stores and break that monopoly that China has. We would expect Albanese to do the same if they are re-elected, that they would go in and negotiate to try and get the removal. But he's also said very clearly there are three areas that are non-negotiable. So the US Trade Representative Office has looked at Australia's pharmaceutical benefit scheme. This is a scheme that lowers the cost of medicines to Australians. Big Pharma in the US don't like it.
Right.
Australia is world leading in some of its restrictions on social media platforms. Particularly, there's a ban on under 16s on social media by the end of the year. So these are things you'd expect. That's what the negotiation will be over. But Australian politicians have said there are some things that we're not prepared to bargain away.
And the Aussie dollar, that has taken a hit.
Yeah.
That's bad for Australian households. It makes imports more expensive.
It's bad for my trip to Europe.
Wayne, this isn't about you. You are important. I'm not saying you're not a valid person.
Well, I mean, that's,
But for the wider economy.
I was just home in Britain to visit my dad, and I couldn't believe how expensive Britain was.
Yeah.
From an Australian dollar point of view. It's frightening.
So people are feeling it in their pocket, like immediately, if they've booked a holiday or... So how is that going down politically, Kirsty? Like as we are in the middle of this election campaign, who is benefiting, if I can put it like that? Who is benefiting from the trade war politically? Which party?
I think if there was, going into the election campaign, it was always known that there would be a Trump factor. It wasn't clear which way that would fall.
Yeah.
But we've seen the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, backpedaling very quickly away from any policies that could be linked to Trump or Trump-like policies. For example, he had said early in the campaign, we need to axe public servants and we don't want people working from home. He's abandoned those policies. Albanese Prime Minister is trying to label Dutton as Trump-like. They're throwing around Doge Dutton.
Right.
So polling is showing that Trump is playing as a negative amongst the Australian public, and that's become the political football. Which side is going to be landed with the Trump label?
Before the trade war, was the Trump label a bad thing? Like, was it something Dutton had been courting?
It was unclear. So he had been labelled Trump light and he denied it. He said, no, I'm an Australian conservative in the conservative tradition. But there were populist policies that were starting to come out on sceptical on renewable energy. Dutton's always been tough on borders and tough on immigration. So perhaps in that aspect, that's something that Trump learnt from Australia and previous conservative governments.
Right.
But certainly the tariffs and it's a 10% tariff, but the sense that Australia's closest security ally could tariff Australia, that's what's hurt the Australian public, the indignity of it.
So what are the polls saying? The election, of course, isn't until May 3rd. What are the polls showing right now?
It's neck and neck.
Okay.
So it's a really tight race and there's a possibility of a minority government. That's where there's a dozen independent lawmakers. And if it's a minority government, those independent lawmakers will have more sway over policy. And that could complicate Australia's response to tariffs, to dealing with volatile Trump and to dealing with China.
On the day Trump made his sweeping tariff announcement, he gave a special shout-out to Australia and its beef farmers.
They won't take any of our beef. They don't want it because they don't want it to affect their farmers.
Australia has restricted the entry of US beef to its market for over 2 decades due to concerns about mad cow disease.
And you know what? I don't blame them, but we're doing the same thing right now, starting about midnight tonight, I would say.
But despite the criticism from Trump, Australia's beef industry is feeling relieved. At a cattle auction in Australia's lush southern highlands, people explain why a 10% tariff isn't a big problem and won't shrink Australia's record beef exports to the United States. Here's livestock agent Dougald McDowell.
If it's 10% on Australia, it's going to be 10% on our natural competitors, which will be Brazil, Argentina, and some of the Asian countries, okay? So if we're all at 10%, it really doesn't change anything.
The tariffs lift the price of imported Australian lean trim beef to about $3.43 a pound. But that's still well below US beef, which is priced around $3.80 after years of dry weather shrank cattle numbers. And a sharp fall in the Australian dollar versus the US dollar gives US buyers an incentive to increase purchases and means Australian sellers receive more local currency per US dollar they receive. Okay, Wayne, so we heard there that the fall in the Aussie dollar is good news for Australian beef farmers selling into the US market. What about the rest of the economy?
It's strange because the Aussie dollar has worked really well for Australia over the years, because Australia is strange in that because it exports mainly commodities, those commodities are priced in US dollars. So when the Aussie dollar falls, the value of those commodities to the miners actually goes up. So the fall in the dollar is, ironically, actually good for the economy overall.
Right.
It will mean import prices go up a little bit, which is bad for the Reserve Bank of Australia. But on the other hand, the threat to global growth is so overwhelming that it's more than likely the RBA will cut rates in May now.
Right.
Cut interest rates again. And the market's beginning to wonder whether they'll cut by 0.5 point, not 1/4 point.
Wow. Before this trade shock, the Australian economy was beginning to motor in the right direction.
Yes, it's just as well that there is scope to cut rates now. Because if this had happened in the middle of last year, we'd be really stuck because inflation was far too high. There's no way the RBA could have cut. But now with inflation coming down, it will slow quite a bit this quarter as well.
Yeah.
The RBA has the scope to cut interest rates, and that's just as well. And the economy has turned around. We had big tax cuts in the middle of last year. People were feeling a bit more confident. House prices suddenly started going up again. Mm-hmm. Everybody loves that, even though they complain about it all the time. this quarter and next quarter, we're looking a lot better. But if the world goes into a recession, it's going to get very tough for Australia.
It's also a big worry for Australia's pension fund industry, right? The country is one of the largest and fastest growing pools of retirement savings in the world, much of it invested overseas. How worried are the authorities about market volatility eating into that pool of money?
Pretty worried, though they would never say so. Luckily, a lot of the super funds, the pension funds here, when they invest abroad, they've tended to hedge their currency exposure.
Okay.
So that a big fall in the Aussie dollar won't hurt them as much. But when you are heavily invested in US tech stocks and US tech stocks fall 10%, that's going to hurt.
Kirsty, Australia did feature its pension pool in its earlier lobbying campaign to stop tariffs being imposed, like pointing out its investments in the US.
Well, Australia's been throwing everything diplomatically at its negotiations with Washington over tariffs to try and stop these tariffs from being imposed. The Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, said he had dined with golfing superstar Greg Norman, who is known to regularly play golf with Trump.
Mm-hmm.
The diplomats in Washington have highlighted the defence relationship between Australia and the United States and the amount of defence hardware that Australia will be buying under AUKUS, and also the weight in the world of the Australian pension funds.
I mean, Kirsty, Australia does have experience dealing with trade disputes with major trading partners. Like, it fell out with Beijing some years back over China's handling of COVID, and it's kind of been on a trade diversification drive ever since.
China's Australia's biggest customer, so the diplomatic dispute and 20 billion in exports were affected when China started imposing a series of unofficial trade barriers on everything except for iron ore, which China relies on Australian iron ore. For Australia, it underpins the economy. From that process, Australia's been very focused on opening up new export markets. So it's really encouraging its exporters to diversify and not be reliant on one major customer, because things can go wrong, and Australia saw that. Diplomats have been in India, in Southeast Asia, the Middle East and the EU, trying to strike free trade agreements and open up new markets. The other diplomatic issue is that, so Australia and the United States had been working very closely to try and counter China's trade investment push throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And so this really undermines that. And Albanese, in his comments, when those tariffs were imposed, pointed out that Southeast Asia had been particularly badly hit by tariffs and suggested that this would play into the strategic competition between China and the US in the region.
All right, so seeing it as a real kind of own goal by the US by doing this.
Oh, huge. China's going around saying now that they are the trading partner that can be trusted.
Right.
Not the US. That's like 180 degrees.
A big thank you to Kirsty and Wayne and everyone who covers Australia and markets and trade at Reuters. It's been a moment this week. Before you go, listener, I have a favour to ask. This pod has been nominated for a Webby Award in 2 categories for our Swiftonomics episode, and there's a public vote to win. If you enjoyed the pod and you like that episode, please vote for us. I'll put links on where you need to go to do that in the description for today's pod. Sound design, music composition, and engineering on this episode was by Alex Summer and Josh Summer. Our podcast team includes Kim Vanell, Tara Oakes, Gail Issa, Christopher Walljasper, Jonah Green, David Spencer, and Sharon Reich Garson. Our executive producer is Leela de Kretzer. Remember, for all your daily news, check out our weekday show, Reuters World News. You can catch it on the Reuters app or wherever you listen to your podcasts.